My name is Rosa Culbreth, and I'm 32 years old. Last November, my mother walked into my apartment without a hello and slid a contractor's invoice across my kitchen counter. $89,000, my sister's new kitchen and master bath. "Transfer it tonight," she said. I told her I hadn't even been invited to Cheryl's housewarming. She said, "She's family. You pay." I folded the invoice once, set it back in her hand, and walked her to the door. For 10 years, I had been this family's checkbook and its ghost at the same time. What none of them knew was that the one person they were all circling, my grandfather, had already made a quiet decision about me. 3 days later, they came for everything I had. That was when it turned. I want to tell you how it got that far. Because it didn't start with $89,000. It didn't even start with money. It started with a word, and the word was strong. In our house, growing up, there were two kinds of daughters. There was Cheryl, who was delicate, who needed things, who cried and got held and got believed. And then there was me. I was the strong one. That's what they called me, the way you'd label a jar so you never have to open it again and check what's inside. Rosa is so independent. Rosa doesn't need much. Rosa can handle it. It took me most of my life to understand that strong was never a compliment in my family. It was a job description. It meant nobody had to worry about me. It meant nobody had to ask. It meant that when there was weight, it went on my back by default. And when there was comfort, it went to Cheryl. And no one ever had to decide any of it out loud because the labels had already decided it for them. Strong was the word they used so they could stop looking at me, and a child who isn't looked at will do almost anything to be looked at. I found out early that the way to earn a glance was to carry something, so I carried. I got very good at carrying. I mistook the strain in my arms for love because it was the only thing that ever made them turn their heads. There's a family photo that still hangs in my mother's hallway. We're all posed on the porch steps. The summer I turned 12. Cheryl is right in the middle, my mother's two hands resting on her shoulders like a frame around a frame. My father stands behind them, and I'm off to one side, half a step back, one shoulder already sliding out of the picture, as if the photographer had run out of room and nobody had thought to shift over and make some. I used to think that was an accident of where I happened to stand. I don't think that anymore. I think that photograph is the most honest thing my family ever produced. I became a software engineer, a senior one now, at a company called Arkwell Systems. I make good money, more than anyone in my family has ever made, which mattered to them in a way I didn't understand clearly until much later, when I finally saw that my income wasn't something they were proud of. It was something they were entitled to. The job came with real pressure. Long weeks, releases that ran past midnight, the specific kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch. But I built a life out of it. Over the years, I bought 3 small rental apartments, unglamorous places in okay neighborhoods, and I spent my weekends fixing them up myself, learning to patch drywall and reseat a toilet and coax an old furnace back to life. I filled them with decent tenants who paid on time. Between the 3 of them, they bring in a little over $4,200 a month. My family called those apartments our safety net. They said it casually, at dinners, the way you'd mention the weather. Our little cushion. Good thing Rosa's got those places. I was the only person who had ever put a single dollar into that net, and somehow it had become ours. Plural. A shared inheritance I was expected to keep patched and full while everyone else rested in it. And I paid. For 10 years I paid. I stopped counting out loud somewhere around year 3 because counting out loud made me sound ungrateful, and ungrateful was the worst thing you could be in my mother's court. But I never actually stopped counting. When my parents' roof failed in a February storm, I wrote a check for $16,000 to replace it. And my mother thanked me by telling Cheryl that I'd finally done something useful. When Cheryl got married, I covered $22,000 of a wedding where I wasn't in a single one of the important photographs. There was my father's truck. There was a semester of something for a cousin. And there were the emergencies. a word my mother deployed the way other people say, good morning, casual, frequent, requiring nothing from her but the asking and nothing from me but the yes, added up across the years, and it was more than $130,000 that left my hands and landed in theirs. Some of it came with a promise stapled on. I'll pay you back next month. I heard that sentence so many times it wore smooth, like a coin handled until the face rubs off. Next month never came. And I want to be honest with you, because this story only works if I'm honest. I let it not come. I never once said, actually, where's the 16,000? I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family, and that being needed was almost the same as being wanted. For a long, long time, I genuinely could not tell those two things apart. That confusion was mine. I own it. Nobody tricked me into a decade of it. I walked in on my own feet, hoping, but late at night, in my dark kitchen, with nothing lit but the blue glow of my phone, I would open my banking app and scroll back through the years, and the numbers began to say something out loud that no person in my family ever would. They said, "This is not a family. This is an account. And you are the one making deposits, and no one is ever going to let you make a withdrawal." If you've ever been called the strong one, just so no one had to ask how you were really doing, stay with me. This story might feel a little too familiar. There was exactly one person who saw me differently, and he'd seen me that way my whole life. My grandfather, Walter Hollis. My mother's father, a retired mathematics professor from Warfield University, 84 years old, still sharp enough to catch a mistake in a paragraph before you'd finished saying it, and patient in a way the rest of the family had never inherited. When I was small, I spent my Sunday afternoons at his house. I understand now that I was being sent away, that my mother needed the house quieter and Cheryl needed more of it. But at the time, it didn't feel like exile. It felt like being chosen. His kitchen had an old oak table with pencil marks worn down into the grain, decades of equations and grocery lists and phone numbers pressed permanently into the wood. He'd make weak tea and let it go cold, forgetting it entirely while he showed me how numbers actually worked, not how to get the answer, how they behaved, why a proof was beautiful, why, unlike everything else in my life, they never lied and never changed the rules on you halfway through. He was the only adult who ever asked me what I thought. And then, this is the part that mattered, actually waited for the answer. He'd ask, and then he'd go quiet. And he'd let the quiet sit there until I filled it, however long it took. Do you know how rare that is for a child who has learned she's furniture? To be asked a real question and then handed a silence big enough to answer inside of? I would have walked across broken glass for those afternoons. In a way, for the rest of my childhood, I did. He knew things about our family that none of us ever said. He watched the room rearrange itself around Cheryl whenever she entered it. He watched me carry the plates in and the trash out. He noticed the things adults are supposed to notice and mostly train themselves not to. Once, when I was maybe 15, sitting at that oak table doing algebra while he graded papers, he said something I didn't understand for almost 20 years. He set down his red pen and looked at me over his glasses and said, "One day, I'm going to make sure the right person gets the right thing." I thought he meant his books. I said I'd like the calculus ones. He smiled and didn't correct me. Here is what the entire family was quietly waiting for. The thing that ran under every holiday, like a current under ice. My grandfather had money, not a fortune, a paid-off house and the savings of a long, careful, frugal life, but enough that a family could let itself dream on the number. They had convinced themselves it was $400,000 or more, sitting somewhere, waiting. And they loved him the way you love a locked safe, patiently, attentively. With math, my Aunt Janet, my mother's younger sister, 55, never once in a room without an angle working somewhere behind her eyes, had perfected the art of steering any dinner toward the subject of the will without ever appearing to touch it. She'd do it so gently. Doesn't Dad seem tired lately? A sip of wine. Has he said anything to anyone about his plans? And then her gaze would drift, casual as smoke, toward me. Because the whole family had decided long ago that Grandpa loved me best, and in their arithmetic that meant I was going to take everything, and so they resented me for a gift I had never been handed. They circled me with a low, permanent envy over an inheritance that did not, by then, even exist. That was the cruelest math of all, and none of them could see it, because none of them knew what I knew. About 2 years before any of this, Grandpa asked me to sit down with him at the oak table, and he poured the weak tea, and he told me something and made me promise to keep it. He had given nearly all of his money away, almost $300,000, moved quietly into an endowed scholarship fund at Warfield in mathematics, earmarked for students who reminded him of the kids nobody expected anything from. Students, he said, who carry more than their share and get called strong for it. He didn't look at me when he said that last part. He didn't have to. The money's already where it should be, he told me, folding his spotted hands on the wood. What I'm keeping is for you, but Rosa, it isn't money. Then he handed me a thick, sealed envelope, heavier than a letter should be, and told me not to open it. When it's time, he said, you'll know. I took it home and put it in a drawer and left it there, unopened, for 2 years, because I trusted him more than I trusted my own curiosity. I promised him I would stay quiet about all of it. I had no idea, sitting at that table, how loud that quiet promise was eventually going to have to become. So that was the true shape of my family on the November evening the invoice arrived. A daughter they'd labeled strong so they'd never have to see her. A fortune they were guarding that had already been given to strangers. And me, in the middle of it, holding a secret and, without quite realizing it, a decade of receipts. Then the invoice showed up. And this one, unlike all the others, had a deadline attached. It was a Tuesday. My mother let herself in. She still had a key I'd never gotten around to reclaiming, and that key tells you almost everything about how I'd lived. And she didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was, didn't glance at the dinner cooling on my stove. She crossed straight to the counter and laid a piece of paper on the stone like she was reminding me to take the bins out to the curb. $89,000. A contractor's letterhead from the expensive firm on the north side of town. Line items for a full kitchen tear-out and a master bath at Cheryl's new house. Near the bottom, circled hard in my mother's blue ballpoint, 3 words, progress payment due. A deposit of $18,000 had already been paid. The next installment was due in 5 days. Miss it, the terms said, and the crew stopped, and the penalties began accruing. Transfer it tonight, she said. I looked at the number for a while, and then I looked at her, and I asked the only question that mattered. Why is this mine? She frowned like the question itself was ill-mannered. And here's a thing I want you to notice, because it becomes important. She didn't answer it. Not then, not later, not once in the entire thing that followed. She never explained why an $89,000 renovation on a house I'd never been inside was my bill, because the real answer was the one thing she could not say in daylight without hearing exactly how it sounded. I picked up my phone instead. Cheryl kept her account public. She always has. She performs her life for an audience. And there it was. Not just a renovation, a housewarming, a whole party, already planned, a long table of people, friends, cousins, Aunt Janet, my parents, every branch of the family raising glasses in a kitchen I was apparently financing. And not me. I scrolled slowly through the faces of people I'd known my entire life, laughing in my sister's new house. And I was not in a single frame, and I had not been asked. I'm not on the guest list, I said. You're on the payment plan, my mother answered. I need you to hear how that landed, because it wasn't shouted. It was said mildly, almost patiently, the way you'd explain something obvious to a slow child. And when I looked up from the phone, I caught it. a flicker across her face when she registered that I'd seen the party, seen my own absence from it. Something close to satisfaction. It was there and gone inside a second. But I saw it, and some cold, quiet part of me filed it away. I wasn't even invited to her housewarming, I said. This is ridiculous. She's family, my mother said. You pay. For 10 years, this was the exact spot where I folded. This is where I'd sigh and open the banking app and tell myself that a transfer was a small price for peace. My thumb even moved toward the phone out of pure habit. But something had gone still in me over those 10 years, some load-bearing thing finally quietly reaching the end of what it could hold. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I was just done. I folded the invoice once, along the crease she'd already pressed into it, and I set it back down in her open hand. This one's yours, I said. I walked her to the door and opened it. She stood on the threshold a moment, waiting for me to break the way I always broke, to call her back and fix it. I didn't. She left. I turned the deadbolt, and I stood alone in my own kitchen listening to the sound of my own breathing in a silence I had never once, in 32 years, chosen for myself. For 3 days after that, there was nothing. And then, all at once, there was everything. The phone started Wednesday morning and did not stop. Cheryl first. 11 missed calls stacked up on my lock screen before noon, blinking at me while I sat trapped in a meeting I couldn't leave. Then the texts began, and they moved through every voice she owned, one after another, like she was working down a list. First the wound. How could you do this to me? Then the wheedle. Come on, Rosa, you know I'd do it for you. Then, when neither worked, the version with teeth in it. The contractor stops Friday, and it's on you. I hope you can live with humiliating your own sister. I do everything for this family. You do one transfer a year, and suddenly, you're the victim? I laid the phone face down on my desk and tried to work. It buzzed against the wood every few minutes like something caught in a jar, and I let it buzz. Meanwhile, my mother went to work. Not her own work. She'd never held a job in my lifetime. But on the story, she spent Wednesday and Thursday calling around the family and telling a version of events I had never once been permitted to narrate. Rosa's got all that money and she's letting her own sister lose her house. Rosa thinks she's better than us now. Rosa's changed. That job changed her. By the second day, I had become the villain of a story I'd never been allowed to write a single line of, and Janet reinforced every beat of it, adding her own soft, expert footnotes about how sad it all was, how disappointing, how she'd always feared success would do this to me. I know all this because the family group chat lit up like a switchboard, my mother's little pinned avatar presiding over it, and because a cousin I hadn't heard from in 3 years texted me out of a clear sky, not to ask a single question about what had actually happened, but to inform me that I should be ashamed of myself. Then, late Wednesday night, my phone lit up with a name I never expected. Nathan, Aunt Janet's son, my cousin, another grandchild exactly like me, except that he'd grown up on the outside of the family too, never quite in the warm center. And I'd never known him well enough to know he'd noticed the same things I had. He'd sent a screenshot with one line under it. "You should see what they're actually saying," he wrote. "This isn't right, and I'm tired of pretending it is." The screenshot was from a smaller chat. Just my mother and Cheryl, the two of them, working out their strategy the way you'd plan a campaign. I stood in my dark kitchen and read it, my thumb frozen over the glass, and I read one line of it 3 separate times. "Just guilt, Rosa," Cheryl had written. "She always folds. She can't stand anyone being mad at her. And honestly, Grandpa's money is basically hers anyway, so it's not like she's even really losing anything." That single line told me 2 enormous things. It told me my compliance hadn't been a coincidence or a kindness. It had been a rehearsed, reliable feature they'd built their plans around for years, whether they could forecast. And it told me that the entire foundation of their resentment, the money they were sure I'd inherit and hated me in advance for, was something they had catastrophically, completely wrong. They were fighting over a fortune that had stopped existing 2 years earlier, and in 3 days, they were going to gather the whole family and double down on it in a room, out loud, in front of witnesses. I should have seen the next escalation coming, but I didn't, because it crossed a line I'd assumed even my mother wouldn't cross. Thursday morning, a coworker I trusted forwarded me an email with a short, careful note attached. "Hey, this came into the general inbox. I think you need to see it." I opened it in the Arkwell parking lot before I'd even gotten out of the car, my coffee going cold in the cup holder, my breath fogging the windshield. It was from my mother, to Colleen Ford, my boss. She had written to my employer to tell them I was unstable, that I was secretly hiding money from my own family and couldn't be trusted with anything that mattered, that the people relying on me at work deserved to know the real me. She'd signed it with her full legal name, formally, like a woman lodging a complaint. The last line said, "I felt her employer should know the kind of person they're truly dealing with before it becomes their problem too." I sat in that cold car for a long time and just breathed. My mother had never once in 10 years called to ask how my job was going. Not when I got the senior title, not through a single one of the midnight releases, not one question, ever, about the work that paid for her roof. And now she'd phoned the front desk twice. I'd learn that part later. And put her name to an email designed to burn down the one thing in my life I had built entirely alone, with no help and no strings from any of them. The one part of me that was purely, uncomplicatedly mine. And somewhere in that frozen silence, the last piece rotated slowly into place and locked. This had never been about the renovation. $89,000 was only ever the excuse, the occasion. This was about putting me back exactly where they'd kept me my whole life. Useful and silent, the strong one who pays and doesn't complain, and above all, does not, ever, say no. My no hadn't just cost them a transfer. It had cracked the story they told about what I was for. And to get that story back, my mother would set fire to my job, my name, my reputation, anything, everything, because a Rosa who could refuse was more dangerous to her than a fire. Fine, I thought, watching my breath fog the glass. If they want this out in the open, I'll give it to them in the open. But we'll use my documents, not her rumors. Before I tell you what happened at that Sunday dinner, tell me in the comments. Has your family ever expected you to pay for a seat at a table they never once saved for you? That night, I opened my laptop and I made a folder, and I gave it the plainest name I could think of, and then I began, for the first time in my life, to put the truth in order. I wasn't building a case for a courtroom. I want to be clear about that, because my mother was already telling everyone I'd become cold and calculating, and I refused to hand her that. I was doing something much simpler and much harder. I was finally telling the truth in the right sequence. 10 years of transfers exported from my banking app, laid out in 3 columns on the screen. Given, promised, repaid. The first column was a wall. The middle column was long. The last column was almost entirely white. Then the texts. Years of "I'll pay you back next month," saved without my ever having decided to save them, because I'm a person who doesn't delete things, and it turned out that quiet habit was the closest thing I had to self-defense. The roof, the wedding, the truck. And then one transfer I couldn't place at all, an odd one from 4 years back. And when I traced it patiently through the records, I found that my mother had borrowed against my name to cover a bill of her own and simply let it land on me, unmentioned, absorbed into the general fog of my paying. 4 years, and she'd never said a word. I'd carried a debt I didn't even know was mine. That one, strangely, hurt more than the big ones because of how casual it was. And then the fresh material, the material from this week. Cheryl's screenshot, my mother's email to Colleen, the strategy chat Nathan had sent me. Just guilt Rosa. She always folds. I was still at that table near midnight when my phone rang, and the name on the screen stopped my hands cold. Grandpa. I braced myself. I actually thought, not him too. I was certain he'd heard the family's version and was calling to talk sense into me, to remind me that family is family, that the strong one keeps the peace, that I should just pay it and let everything go back to the way it had always been. I had been let down so many times by then that I'd started expecting it even from him. "Have you eaten today, Rosa?" he asked. I sat there in the lamplight and I could not answer for a moment. Because in 3 days of ringing phones and burning bridges, 3 days of my own mother trying to end my career and my own sister rehearsing how to break me, not one single human being had asked me one single thing about me. Nobody had asked if I was tired, if I was frightened, if I'd slept, if I'd eaten. Only him. The 84-year-old man they were all orbiting as if the only interesting thing about him was his money. Not really, I admitted. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "Then go eat something," he said. "Real food, not standing up over the sink." A pause. "And Rosa, the family is having a get-together Sunday at Cheryl's new place. I'd like you to come. Sit next to me." "Grandpa, you know what they're going to do to me there." "I know exactly what they're going to do." He let that hang, unhurried, the way he let everything hang. Then, lower, in the voice he used to use when he was about to teach me something that mattered. "There's a thing this family needs to hear said out loud, Rosa, and I'd rather be the one to say it than leave it for after I'm gone. Will you let me?" I didn't sleep much that night, but before I shut the laptop, I did 2 things. I pulled up the endowment paperwork he'd shown me 2 years earlier, the record of almost $300,000 given away to students I'd never meet, and I added it to the folder. And I went to the drawer and took out the thick sealed envelope, the one I'd guarded unopened for 2 years, and I set it on top of the stack of receipts, where it sat like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet. They had spent years hating me over money that was already gone. And in 3 days, they would sit around my sister's brand new table and try to shame me for it, with no idea that the old man at the head of that table had known the whole truth all along and had been waiting, patiently, with math, for the right moment to set it down. The next morning, Colleen called me into her office. "Bring your coffee," she said, which is just a thing she says. But I still walked down that hallway not knowing whether I was about to be defended or quietly managed out. She had my mother's email printed and lying face down on her desk. She turned it over, slid it a few inches toward me, and then she did the thing I will never forget. She didn't ask me whether any of it was true. She didn't make me stand there and defend my own sanity to my boss. "I've worked with you for 4 years," she said, folding her hands. "I know what you're like at 11 at night when a build is failing and everyone else has gone home. One email from a stranger doesn't get to outweigh 4 years of that." She tapped the paper. "We've logged it as harassment. HR has it. If she contacts anyone here again, there's a process, and it won't be your problem to manage. You don't have to do a single thing, Rosa. I brought you in because I wanted you to see with your own eyes that we already handled it and that it is not going to touch your job. Not now. Not later." I did not cry in front of her, though I wanted to badly enough that my throat ached. 4 years of showing up and doing careful, quiet, excellent work, and it turned out that here, in the one part of my life where I had never spent a dollar trying to buy anyone's regard, I was believed on sight. No receipts required. Just the work, seen and remembered by someone who'd bothered to look. At the door, Colleen said one more thing and it followed me out. "Whatever you decide with your family this weekend, decide it as someone who's already enough, not someone still auditioning to be." When I got back to my desk, there was a paper coffee cup on it, still warm, and a yellow sticky note pressed onto the bottom edge of my monitor. It was from Trevor, an engineer on my team, a guy who talks easily to everyone and owes nothing to anyone. The note said, in blocky engineer print, "Whatever this is, you're not the problem. T." I sat down and held that warm cup with both hands, and I thought about something so simple it embarrassed me to be learning it at 32. The strangers were kinder than the blood. The people who owed me nothing kept quietly handing me things. A printed email, a warm cup, a note. The people who owed me everything had only ever come to take. I had spent a decade with the arithmetic exactly backwards. That was the thing that finally straightened my spine. Not rage, not a fantasy of revenge. Just the plain, overdue understanding that I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place from people who had priced me, before I could even speak, at exactly what I could carry and not 1 ounce more. So I decided to go to Sunday dinner. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking in to apologize. I was walking in to finish something. The invitation, when it finally came, was almost funny. My mother typed it herself. Sunday. Cheryl's house. The whole family will be there. You will explain yourself. After 32 years of being sent away, I had finally been invited. To my own trial. A second text arrived a minute later, and I could feel her satisfaction radiating through the glass. Grandpa is coming too. She sent it like a threat, like she'd locked in the judge and stacked the jury. She was certain his presence was her trump card, the weight that would finally force me to fold in front of everyone. She had no idea that she'd just handed me the one detail that made me absolutely sure I would show up. He'd asked me to sit beside him. He hadn't told me why or what he meant to say. I looked at the sealed envelope on my table and thought about opening it, about arming myself ahead of time with whatever he'd written. And I decided not to. He'd said when it's time, and I had trusted this man my entire life to know the right time better than I did. I'd waited 2 years. I could wait 4 more days and let him choose the moment himself. I spent that week the way you'd expect. Quiet, deliberate. I printed the receipts, 3 clean copies of everything. I put the endowment paperwork in the folder. I set the sealed envelope on top, and I slid the whole folder into a plain canvas tote by my front door, where I'd see it every time I passed. And on the drive over that gray December Sunday, I practiced one single thing. Not a speech. I practiced staying quiet enough to be heard, because I'd learned something at that oak table decades ago, without knowing I was learning it. The loudest person in a room is almost never the one who's right. They're only the one most afraid of the silence. I parked behind a long row of cars I recognized, cars belonging to people who had already tried and convicted me over the phone. I sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and let my heartbeat settle. Then I picked up the tote, and I walked in. Cheryl's new house smelled like fresh paint and money that wasn't hers. The renovation wasn't even finished. There was blue tape still on the trim, a new sink sitting in its box in the corner, an extension cord snaking across the floor. But they'd laid out food and wine, and pulled the entire extended family into it regardless. 15, maybe 18 people. Aunts, cousins, my parents, a couple of faces I could barely place. A long table ran the length of the open room, set like a stage. And at the head of that table sat my grandfather, small in a large chair, his cane hooked over the armrest, his hands folded on the wood, watching the door. Watching for me. The talking stopped when I came in. My mother rose from her seat like a woman who had been rehearsing her entrance all week. "Good. You're here," she announced, to the room more than to me. "We're all here, Rosa, because you need to explain to this family why you abandoned your sister the one time she truly needed you." There was an empty chair waiting at the far end of the table, isolated, angled toward everyone else, the defendant's chair. I felt every pair of eyes move to it, herding me toward it. I didn't sit in it. I walked the entire length of that table, past all of them, past my mother, past Cheryl's wet, waiting face, and I pulled out the chair beside my grandfather, and I sat down next to him. He didn't turn his head. But under the table, his dry old hand found my forearm and closed around it once, firmly, and let go. It said, "Good girl." It said, "Steady." It said, "I've got the ending. You just hold the line." The room shifted. You could feel it move through the whole gathering like a change in air pressure. That was not in anyone's script. Cheryl started to cry immediately. It's her oldest and most reliable skill, and she deployed it now, dabbing at her eyes with a linen napkin, telling the table through delicate hitching breaths that she couldn't believe her own sister would let her lose her home over pride, that the contractor was walking Friday, that she'd be humiliated in front of every person she knew, that she'd never done anything to deserve this. Janet took her cue on schedule. She set her wine glass down with a soft, precise click and turned to me with that gentle, dangerous voice, the one she used for knives. After everything this family has given you, Rosa, after everything, you would let your sister lose her house over what, exactly? Money? You, of all people, standing there worried about money? A pause, waited and aimed. It's not as though you won't be very well taken care of when the time comes. There it was, out on the table before the food was even served. The inheritance, the real engine under all of it, wheeled into the open by Janet herself. And she didn't even seem to register that she'd shown the whole room the machinery. Then my mother took over, and I understood, watching her rise fully to her feet, that she had been waiting for this precise moment for most of her life. The whole family assembled, every witness in place. Her chance to make it official, to say the thing out loud with a jury present and have them all nod. You have always been the one who pays, she said, and her voice began to climb. That is what you are for, Rosa. Do you understand me? That is your place in this family, it always has been, and no job and no attitude changes it. And you are going to inherit every cent your grandfather has anyway, so don't you dare stand there and act like you've been robbed. That's what you're for. She said it to a room full of witnesses. She said it out loud, to my face, at her daughter's brand new table, and for one long suspended second the entire room heard exactly what she had said. Not implied, not softened. Said, and so did she. I watched it reach her own ears a half-beat after it left her mouth. I watched her want it back. The silence that followed changed temperature. An aunt near the middle of the table set down her glass and did not pick it back up. A cousin found something fascinating in the weave of the tablecloth. Someone exhaled through their nose. And at the far end, my father, Wayne Culbreth, who had not said one word, studied his own folded hands, the way he had studied his hands at every hard moment of my entire life, and for the first time, in front of everyone, his silence stopped looking like neutrality and started looking like exactly what it was, a choice, one he'd made a long time ago, one that had never once been made in my favor. I did not raise my voice. I want you to know that, because it's the whole point. I never raised my voice a single time. I reached into the tote, and I took out the first page, and I laid it flat on the table between the serving dishes, and I turned it so the people nearest could read it right side up. This is 10 years, I said, quietly. Every dollar I've paid into this family. The roof, $16,000. Cheryl's wedding, $22,000. Dad's truck. The emergencies. It comes to $130,000. I laid my finger on the last column, the white one. And this is everything that has ever come back to me. You can see how much room there was to write it in. Nobody reached for the page. Nobody needed to. They could read the shape of it from where they sat. The dense black wall on one side, the clean, empty white on the other. A marriage of columns that told the entire story without a single adjective. I laid down the second page beside it. This is my sister and my mother 3 days ago, deciding how to handle me. I didn't read it aloud. I'd decided in advance that I wouldn't perform any of it. I would just set it down and let them meet it themselves. Cheryl's own eyes found her own words on the page. Just gilt Rosa, she always folds. And the napkin in her hand went completely still. And the tears, interestingly, stopped. Because you cannot cry and calculate at the same time, and she had just been forced back into calculating. I laid down the third page. And this is my mother, I said, writing to my employer this week, under her own name, to tell them I'm mentally unstable and dishonest, so that I would lose my job if I didn't pay this bill. I placed it in the center of the table, face up, her formal signature plain at the bottom for anyone to see. That's the part I want the family to sit with. Not that she asked me for money, that she tried to take my livelihood when I said no. Each page changed the room a little more. That was the entire method. I set the truth down one piece at a time, in order, and I let each piece do its own quiet work. And I stayed silent in the gaps between them and let the silence carry the weight my voice didn't need to. My mother's face had gone a shade I had never seen on it. That's private. You had no right to bring that. And that was the moment my grandfather laid his hand flat on the table. May I say something? He said. It was not a question, and everyone knew it wasn't. The entire room turned to him, the way it always had, the way it had for decades, because he was the true center they'd all been orbiting the whole time. And I watched a small, desperate hope flare across my mother's face, the certainty that Dad was finally about to step in, restore order, put me back in my chair, and set the family arithmetic right again. The money you've all been counting, he said in the mild and level voice of a man who spent 50 years explaining difficult truths to frightened students, is gone. I gave it away 2 years ago, nearly $300,000, to a scholarship fund at Warfield, for students no one ever expected anything from. He let it settle over the table like snow. There is no inheritance. There has been no inheritance for 2 years. Every bit of resentment some of you have carried, every calculation. You've been dividing up an empty room. I have never in my life heard a house go that quiet. 18 people in one space and not one sound, not a fork, not a breath. Janet's mouth opened and opened again with nothing in it. Cheryl turned and stared at my mother as if waiting to be told it wasn't true. And my mother looked at her own father with the expression of a person who has just felt the floor tilt under a house she believed was on solid ground. What's left? My grandfather went on. And now he did turn, slowly, deliberately, until he was looking directly at me. I am leaving to the one grandchild who ever asked me how I was. Not what I had, how I was. He reached over with one spotted hand and tapped the sealed envelope still sitting on top of my folder, the one I had never opened. And it isn't money, Rosa. You'll understand when you read it. I've been wanting you to understand for a very long time. Then he turned back to face the length of the table, to all of them, his 2 daughters and his grandchildren and the whole assembled family, and he asked one question, in a voice that did not rise even slightly. In 30 years, he said, which one of you ever once asked that girl if she was okay? Nobody answered. Nobody could. I watched them reach for a reply and come back empty, one after another, the way you pat your pockets for keys that aren't there. My mother's mouth worked and produced nothing. Cheryl looked down at her lap. Janet stared into her wine. And in that long, terrible, honest silence, everything they actually were lay exposed on the table right beside my receipts. And there was simply nothing left to argue about, because the argument had never been about the invoice at all, and now everyone in the room knew it. I stood up. I gathered my pages back into the folder without hurrying, squaring the edges. I was not triumphant. I need you to believe that, because it's true, and because it's the difference between this story and the revenge I could have chosen instead. There was no rush of victory, no swelling music, no scene I'd been savoring in advance. There was only a very old exhaustion beginning, at last, to lift off my back. And underneath it, waiting. Grief. I'm not paying the invoice, I said, and my voice stayed low and even. I'm not going to stand here and explain myself to this family ever again. And I am finished being what I'm for. I picked up my grandfather's coat from the back of his chair and held it open for him. He took my arm and rose slowly to his feet, steadying on the cane, and the 2 of us turned together toward the door. Behind us, I heard the room begin to move, chairs scraping, low voices starting up. The whole clumsy machinery of a family realizing that the math had changed and that this time it could not be changed back, no matter who cried or who called or what story got told next. At the door I stopped, And without turning around, I said one last thing. The rest of you can keep the bill. It was always yours. Then I opened the door. The December air came in cold and clean and smelled like nothing was owed. And in front of me, for the first time I could remember in my whole life, was a doorway I actually wanted to walk through, with the one person who had ever seen me holding onto my arm. Nobody paid the $89,000. That's the first thing you should know about the after, because I know part of you is wondering how it all landed once the door closed. The contractor stopped that Friday, exactly as the invoice had promised he would. And Cheryl, for the first time in her adult life, had to sit across a table from a man who did not care about her tears and learn precisely what her own name could and could not sign for. She scaled the whole thing down. The dream master bath became a smaller, ordinary bath. The magazine kitchen became a good enough kitchen with laminate instead of stone. She discovered what things actually cost when there is no strong older sister standing by to absorb the difference between what you want and what you can afford. As far as I know, she is still discovering it, one invoice at a time, and I've made my peace with not being the one who explains the numbers to her anymore. My mother lost something harder to put a figure on. She had been telling her version of me to the whole family for years, unchallenged, and in a single evening they had all watched that version come apart, with the receipts sitting right there in the middle of the table where anyone could read them. In the days that followed, some of the aunts and cousins began texting me. Small messages. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. That wasn't right. What she did. I read every one of them, and I noticed something I want to be honest with you about, because it took me a while to let myself see it clearly. Most of them were apologizing for what they had finally been forced to see that night, not for the 10 years they had spent looking comfortably away. That is a real difference. It matters. I answered them kindly, and I did not pretend the difference wasn't there. My father never said a word. Not that night, not after. Wayne Culbreth watched his wife try to weaponize his daughter's entire childhood, and then watched his own father calmly take the weapon apart, and he sat through all of it studying his hands. And when it was over, he sent me nothing at all. For 32 years his silence had felt to me like a kind of gentleness, a father staying out of it. Now I could finally see it for what it had always been. Silence. When someone you love is being harmed at your table, is not neutrality. Neutrality is a fiction people hide inside. He had chosen a side long before I was old enough to notice, and the side he chose was never once mine, and the quiet was how he kept from having to admit it out loud. A few days after the dinner, my mother texted me. It was not an apology, and I want to be precise about that, because the shape of what she sent is the whole point. It said, I hope you're proud of yourself. You've torn this family apart over money and embarrassed us in front of everyone. After everything I sacrificed for you, I read it twice, and then I did something I had never once done in 32 years. I answered her without flinching, and I kept it short. I still love you, I wrote. I'm just done being useful instead of being loved. I set the phone face down on the counter, and I did not wait for the reply, and this is the part that genuinely astonished me. I did not go back and check for it later either. For my entire life, I had listened for that woman's approval the way you strain to hear a radio station that only ever plays static, certain that if I just adjusted myself a little more, a little better, the music would finally come through. I turned the radio off. The quiet that came after was enormous, and for the first time, it belonged to me. I want to tell you it felt like nothing but freedom. It didn't. And I won't lie to you about that, because someone listening to this needs to hear the true version and not the clean one. A boundary can be exactly, unarguably right and still hurt like something torn out by the root. I grieved. I grieved a mother I had never actually had and had never, in 3 decades, stopped hoping would someday arrive. I grieved a sister I'd wanted to be close to since we were small. I grieved the family in that porch photograph, The one where I'm already half out of the frame, because some stubborn child inside me had spent 30 years trying to climb back into the center of it, and I had to finally accept that there had never been room made for me there, and there never would be, and no amount of carrying was ever going to build it. That is a death. And you are allowed to mourn a death even when walking away was the only sane thing left to do. That was the week I finally opened the envelope. I did it alone, at my own kitchen counter, the same stretch of counter where my mother had laid the invoice down like it was garbage day. Inside was a letter in my grandfather's slanting hand, the ink a little uneven the way it gets now that his fingers ache. A faint old ring of tea stain pressed into one corner where he must have set his cup down and forgotten it while he wrote. I won't read you the whole thing. Some of it belongs only to me, and I've learned to keep the things that are mine. But there is one part I have to tell you, because it took me apart, and because it took apart the story I had carried on my back my entire life without ever once questioning it. He wrote, "You were never the strong one, Rosa. You were only the one they decided to make carry everything, and then they called you strong so they would never have to thank you for it or ask how heavy it was. I watched them do it to you for 30 years. My great regret is that I could not change the way they chose to see you, so I did the one thing I could. I made certain that at least one person in your life saw you clearly, all the way through, and told you so plainly before it was too late for it to matter. And then, at the very bottom, under his signature, the house is yours, not because you are owed it, because it is the one place on this earth where you were ever truly seen, and I want you to fill it with a different kind of life than the one they handed you." He was leaving me the house. His house. The oak table with the pencil marks pressed into the grain. The kitchen that smelled like chalk and old paper and cold tea. The one room in the entire world where a child had once been asked what she thought, and then handed a silence large enough to grow an answer in. Not because I was owed, because I was seen. I have never in my life been given a single thing that didn't arrive with a ledger stapled to the back of it, a running account of what I'd now owe in return. This was the first. And sitting there at my counter, it was not the house that finally broke me open and let the tears come. It was that one sentence. You were never the strong one. 32 years I had carried that word like it was the truest thing about me, the load-bearing beam of my whole self, and he simply reached across all those years and lifted it off my shoulders and told me, quietly, that it had never once been true. It is December now, 2025, as I sit here telling you this. The first snow came last week and stayed. I've been spending my Sundays at my grandfather's house again. Our house. I'm still learning to let myself say it that way. Nothing dramatic has changed about the place. The oak table is still there, and the pencil marks, and the drawer that sticks in humid weather. But I sit at that table now as a grown woman who is allowed, without condition, to be there. Not a child sent away from somewhere she wasn't wanted. We make weak tea and let it go cold, both of us, out of what I suppose is heredity. He shows me equations I already know perfectly well, just so the two of us have a reason to sit together a while longer. And outside the window the first snow comes down slow and unhurried and settles over the whole yard and makes every tired old thing out there look, for a morning, brand new. I'm low contact with the rest of them now, not cruel about it. I don't slam any doors, I don't make speeches, I don't post a word. I simply stopped answering the calls that only ever came when something was needed from me. I made myself unreachable as a resource, which it turns out is the only version of me most of them ever knew how to call. If any one of them ever decides they want a daughter or a sister instead of an account, the door isn't locked. I made sure of that, for my own sake more than theirs. But I am done standing inside it, holding it open with my own body while they file past me to the table, thanking me for the draft. I took the porch photo down, the one where I'm half out of the frame. I didn't burn it or tear it up or make a moment of it. I just put it in a box in the closet, where old things go to be kept without being displayed. And in its place, on the wall right beside the oak table, I hung a new one. It's just the two of us, my grandfather and me, at that table, 2 cups of tea going cold between us. Nobody's hands resting on anybody's shoulders to show possession. Nobody in the center and nobody pushed to the edge. Just 2 people who actually see each other sitting exactly where they belong. Here's the last thing I understand now that I did not understand before, and then I'll let you go. You cannot buy your way into being loved. I know how obvious that sounds said plainly like that. It was not obvious to me, not for one single day of 32 years. I truly believed that if I paid enough, the roof, the wedding, the emergencies, the $130,000, the silence, the strength, the endless, uncomplaining carrying, I could finally purchase myself a place in the center of that porch. But love that comes with a price tag attached was never love in the first place. It was rent. And I paid it faithfully, every month, for 10 years, on a room they were never, ever going to let me actually live in. So I stopped waiting to be chosen by people who only wanted to spend me. I chose myself instead. And it turned out that the thing I'd been trying to buy my whole life had never had a price, and had always, quietly, been enough. If setting a boundary with people you still love has ever cost you something, the guilt that follows you around, the silence on the other end, the empty chair at a table that was never really set for you, I'd like you to tell me about it below. Somebody scrolling past tonight needs to hear, from someone who's been there, that they are not cruel for finally choosing themselves. And if this story found its way to you tonight, stay a while.